get better reliability with SLOs. This is heavily adapted from Datadog's SLO workshop that we're performing at Dash, assumably, and our upcoming summits. Now, the subtitle for this, because it doesn't make any sense until you hear it, is SLAEIOU and definitely why. But no matter how I tried to write it, it just doesn't make sense until you hear it. So what we're going to cover today are specifically the SLIs, SLOs, and SLAs and what those mean, defining quality targets, error budgets, and some practical examples. But you may be wondering who that bearded beauty is and why is he talking to me? Well, I'm Waldo. I used to be a productive member of society before I took this job, but I come from a systems and ops engineering background, spent a lot of time in the DevOps community doing SRE type stuff. But before I accidentally went to the right conference, I used to be a fairly typical bitter, angry sysadmin type. The DevOps community was still pretty new in 2011 when I first went to Velocity, but it was revelatory for me and really changed my life. It literally changed my career in so many ways, because at that point I'd simply never been in an organization that didn't have a contentious and sometimes even antagonistic relationship between the people who made things and the people who made them available. Now, because of this and the relationships between DevOps and SRE, I'm here to talk about one of the steps that enables a healthy transition to incorporating DevOps and SRE practices into your organizations. So technical people love acronyms, and in this case, we've got at least 3 TLAs that are very similar, so it's easy to get them mixed up. So we'll start with some nice, tidy definitions. SLAs. These are, as you can see, a quantitative measurement that expresses a particular aspect of a service. It's often a metric, but it doesn't have to be. The other key word here is quantitative. You have to be able to measure it with a reasonable degree of accuracy. It can't just be a gut feeling. SLIs are part of the basis of SLOs, so we'll look at that next. These are a target value for a service as measured by an SLI. Wow. The idea here is to pick a reasonable value that should be maintained or strive for in a given SLI. And we'll get into examples later, but the core here is that it's a target, it's a goal. And you don't necessarily want to exceed that, which we'll come to later. This is ultimately a way of measuring the success or failure of a service over time. Now, SLOs build on SLAs, which if you've worked in tech for any amount of time, you're probably much more familiar with. Now, this is a contract that defines the results and consequences of meeting or not meeting your agreements with your customers, whether they be internal or external. Like agreement, promise, and contract are all words that are often going to be associated with SLAs. And they can have, for instance, financial penalties. The important here is that it's a statement that codifies what happens when an SLO target is missed. In principle, the result can be anything, but it's commonly a business decision or has a financial repercussion. Now, as you may be able to guess, there's more than just monitoring tools at play. It's really a team effort that comes to identifying, scoping, and defining, and ultimately implementing your SLIs, SLOs, and SLAs. So you want to focus on the user experience, and your users are anybody who consumes your service, whether they're internal or external to the company, other services that build upon your product. It doesn't matter. Anything who consumes what you produce. So let's talk about what quality products targets look like. The user experience is first. in the end, everything should come back to thinking about the user's experience. So how do they interact with your product? How do they use their product? What's their workflow and where do you fit in? What services do they interact with? And what do they want? What do they expect? We'll come back to these. So not everything makes a good SLI. Like, nobody cares about your CPU utilization. They probably don't care about your memory. And as long as things are working, they don't care about any of the system stats for the most part. Values are metrics or events, typically. Now, there are a lot of metrics and rubrics that you can use to find a good SLI, but using things that make sense for the type of service that you're providing, using may not apply to the type of service that you're running. Reliable failure conditions are also indicators too, and you should be able to answer why. Apologies, I live in Florida, so everywhere I go is dry in comparison. So SLOs will have both a target and a time window. And it's not uncommon for them to also be like a complex statement, including percentiles of a metric over a given period of time. As I said, indicated before, there's usually a penalty associated with SLAs. They're often financial. This is much more common when money is changing hands between individuals or corporations. If you're doing this between teams and orgs within the same company, it's, well, indicative of several things usually. Now let's talk about error budgets. It's fun to think about moving fast and breaking things, but let's move fast and fix things. Failure is going to happen whether you do anything or not. So how you respond is important. The idea behind the entire SLO concept is that you can balance innovation and novelty with reliability and stability. So your error budget comes from your product team and product owners. The actual objective should be measured by, like the SLI, the indicator, should come from a neutral party like your monitoring services. Now, the difference between the measurement and the objective is your error budget. Now, just like budgets in most large organizations and government, if you don't use it, it goes away, and you want to spend as much of it as you can without going over. If your SLO is being met, and say you have an outage, unless it's very critical, you don't necessarily need to jump on it. You don't need to treat it as an alarm. You can come back to it when you have a few minutes. You can treat this as downtime. You can treat this as an opportunity to test out a new version when you might have otherwise had to plan something. Now, if the budget is 0 or negative, you should be concentrating on reliability. It's at this point that new feature development stops and you start going on bug hunts. Now, how many of you do like bug squashing sprints or projects where you go through your backlog or your previous incidents and try to squash bugs? Show of hands. About half of you, that's actually impressive. This is a way to make this a more common part of the cadence, and it also encourages you to do this just as a regular part of your sprint planning, or maybe as the bonus, what do you call it? Your stretch goals for the sprint. Like if you get your new features done, you can also already plan to squash certain bugs ahead of time. So, practical examples. What does this look like? I co-wrote this with a friend of mine, Daniel Marr, who you may know as Frosty on Twitter, and he likes to subtly screw with me in a lot of ways, and I mean, it goes both ways. But that character at the end is pronounced F, so this is photosite.nef, which is fun to say, but also critically not real. But we have to consider, for a hypothetical service, we have to consider how the users are interacting with our service. They're clicking around, they're viewing photos, they do searches. Their workflow, they log in, they upload and search for photos, they view, pull things down. And the services that comprise what they think of as our site have account backend, upload services, storage features, and so on. And what do they want? They want it to be there, and they want it to be fast. So, our indicators for the responsive request: could the server respond to it? How long did it take? And how many requests can we handle? Are we scaled appropriately? As far as storage goes, can they get what they want when they want it? How long does it take? And is the data there when it's needed? And as far as pipeline goes, did they get the right thing? Are they a cat person and accidentally got a dog picture? Is our index completely messed up? And how long does it take for a new photo to be available for their view or for others to search for it? So, some more tips. I work for Datadog. We have an SLA product. And this is a way to make it easy for you, because a lot of other things don't have this built in. We make it easy for you to figure out what SLOs work for you, but also make them transparent to the teams that you're working with, so you can show across the org how you're working right now and if you're meeting your agreements. But these are typically based on monitors, and these are often tied to metrics, but they don't have to be. This is typically, like I said earlier, a value per period of time, and can often be a percentile if you prefer. Now, we can also do event-based, which are typically thought of as logs, and this is essentially a success ratio. Now, is anybody not familiar with the four golden signals or red? Okay, that's fine. So the four golden signals, I believe this came out of a Google paper, but I mean, it was formalized in a Google paper, if I remember right. These are four things that you can be, with a strong degree of confidence, apply to most any type of metric or service. How long does it take for a request to a response to happen? How much traffic is incoming to your service, and are you scaled appropriately? What is your percentage of errors, and are they coming from your user or from your service or services you depend on? And how can you mitigate those? It allows you to start thinking about how you can mitigate different areas of that. And the saturation. How much of the capacity do you have are you using? Now, no matter what you do, again, focus on your users. It's very easy to get tied up in the caught up in the weeds and forget, but the users are the reason that you're here and that you do the work that you do. So define your user stories and your journeys first. Figuring out your SLIs and your SLOs comes later. Involve all your stakeholders as well. especially product. I know, so part of, it's not DevOps days anymore, but I consider DevOps to be about the business, and that includes everybody in the business. That includes like straight up product people or accounts receivable and your legal team. Anybody who has a stake, which is really anybody in the company who can provide value, should be included. This is one of those things that you can and should start small and iterate with. It's kind of, most of the organizations I've been in demanded 100% uptime, and it's not healthy. So it can be uncomfortable knowing that something is broken, knowing that something that user-facing is broken, and not stopping what you're doing to go fix it. But you have to let that go. And no, I'm not singing. But realize that the error budgets are there to make your life better and ultimately to make your customer service better. It's okay, like not everybody needs everything to be available all the time. So building out, it can take time to figure this out. So starting off with SLOs, a good way is to not make them strict. Start establishing a baseline of, like, do people actually start complaining if I only have 2 nines of availability? Because there's usually a significant cost difference between every 9 or 5 of availability that you add. So find out if that's even, like, is 4 nines even necessary or reasonable? It's probably not for a lot of things. So in the beginning, err on the side of naivety. And these are some hard-won lessons from Datadog's own SRE team. Should keep in mind that these are not written in stone. Your SLOs can and should change. You should reevaluate these, especially as not just your environment, but within your company and your entire ecosystem changes. SLEs have to have the capability to evolve as well. And if you don't have a way to do this, to make it very apparent, at least to the people within your team, grab something. I don't care what tool you use. Like, I'm an evangelist for Datadog. I would love for you to use Datadog, but I still want you to have the insight tooling that you want and deserve, something that makes your life better. Now, as a bonus, we have some more letters for you. So like I said, SL, A, E, I, O, U, and definitely Y. I've worked in places that didn't have one production environment, but they had like 30. Everything, any fault, any flaw was considered pager worthy, even though only one environment was user-facing at a given time. Now, these were things that were called staging or integration or load test, but their corporate culture was such that if anything was broken, if anybody could consider it a blocker to what they were trying to do at the moment, it was a pager-worthy event. This is not healthy. If you have multiple environments as part of your SLOs and your API documentation, you should be clear about what things like your staging environment is for and needs. Is it for your team to test things, whether a new feature or test your deployment mechanisms, or is this for other teams to test their integrations with? Now, once you've defined what that is, what your, say, staging environment's for, then describe what your SLO is for that environment. It should be nowhere near what your SLO is for your production environment. Let's see, we've done SL A, E, I, O, and that's it. So SLU is for updates. Again, they're not written in stone. You should periodically review them. Ask yourself if they make sense. And then, you know, are you targeting the right uptime? Does it make sense? Now, something that's happened to me plenty of times is I'll throw out a proof of concept and find, a month later, unbeknownst to me, it's become mission critical to the company. Everybody uses it, loves it, depends on it, but I built it on a single VM with no load balancing and no backups, so on and so forth. It's something I hacked together for a few minutes, and it happened to be useful. Well, did something become more important than you realized? So this is something you need to coordinate with your other teams. Likewise, if you're a 3.9 service and there's a 4.9 service that has a hard dependency on you, well, that doesn't work. You cannot be dependent on something less reliable than you unless you take significant actions to mitigate that. So you need to identify the hard requirements, and if you can't engineer around them, you need to spend effort in improving your own resiliency. I mean, it's just surprising how common it is that like a proof of concept just kind of slides into production and just absolutely mandatory, mission critical. So when it comes time to pull the trigger on making a service level update, put out a quick survey to your peers, to your fellow product teams, or RFC it to your customers, again, internal or X. And when a decision is made, broadcast that information. Update your docs, update your SLO widgets, and communicate it. Let fly that email blast in all its glory that nobody's going to read, but at least you have sent it to your internal customers. And finally, we're going to do SLY, more properly spelled SLWHY. This is really the first step towards bringing sanity to the operations of your products. In too many places, like I mentioned before, any outage, any disturbance in service is considered an emergency, and it's just not healthy. If our businesses demand 100% uptime, we don't have time to experiment or innovate or even make healthy mistakes. Here's the thing. The truth behind building individual crickets. All right, fine. The truth behind building individual services so that they're better resilient to faults in their dependencies makes for a better user experience. Additionally, having a healthier relationship with faults by preventing every single one to be a 3-alarm fire allows teams to more comfort and flexibility when those faults do and will appear. Now, this also allows, because they're not such a stressful thing, individual product teams, especially engineers who have not spent a lot of time doing operations, if there's less of an emergency and fire drill attitude behind it, they're going to be much more willing to take on their own resiliency by owning their own uptime and availability of the services that they create. So what we've covered today is SLIs, SLOs, and SLAs, as well as the other vowels. We've talked about defining what quality targets look like, error budgets, and shown you some practical examples. I am with Datadog, so of course I have to plug my dear beloved employer. If you're not familiar with us, we're a premier insight tooling and observability platform. We have a booth out there. We are a fine purveyor of excellent conference t-shirts. I don't have any with me. I mean, this one's slightly used, but I'm pretty sure we have more at the booth. And we have a free trial that's very low impact and gives you access to everything, including our fantastic support. So with that, I want to thank you very much. I love you all. Thank you. And if you'd like, I have some stickers up front. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, Scale. This has been my first Scale, and I forgot to say, be gentle. You've been gentle. Does anybody have questions?
Can you talk about the different S's in relation to like downstream dependencies? You started touching on it, but I want to understand how more, even if they have the same number of nines, how do you do the first one, like the second one goes down? Like how do you like what happens? You know what do you kind of see what I'm saying? Like,
how do you deal with your dependencies when run as a...
Within the org, you have a front end and a back end.
Yep.
And there's obviously joint SLAs between each one, but for different groups and stuff like that. How do you write this into the SLI? The different SLAs.
Okay. The question is, how do you, say, document and identify and deal with the SLOs when you yourself have dependencies?
Yes.
Okay. So this is an exercise that should start perhaps low in the ecosystem, low stack-wise. So you can start with like your storage and your load balancer availability and things like that. A healthy step in, I talk about this in other things, I left it out here. A healthy thing to do is identify all your requirements and not just, hey, I call to our authentication service or our inventory service, but like, I need LDAP to work, load balancer access, be as silly as you want, but identifying requirements that you have, things you need to work in order for your service to function. And if possible, especially if those are internal services, ask them to start thinking about this. It doesn't have to be an initial SLO, or it can be an initial, it doesn't have to be as formalized yet, but start getting them to think about it and publish yours as a draft SLO, or like as of this date stamp, we are targeting this, but you could list risks and dependencies. These do not have defined SLO targets. And just be prepared to, especially in the beginning, iterate more often on how often or what kind of SLO you're actually targeting and what's reasonable for you to expect given the availability of your dependent services.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I was afraid I was word salad there.
Good question. So I'm familiar with SLIs, SLOs, SLAs, and the question is, what pain points do you see trying to migrate to a system, getting a team to work together to identify and collect those SLOs in a useful way so you then begin to attach them?
Is the question, how do I get teams to like participate in this exercise at all and start thinking about SLOs so that you can do it more broadly?
Yeah, it's a multi-part question. Team was part of it, but also you touched on identifying like portal vendors, you touched on identifying those, but putting that into practice, I guess, the whole entire question. What should we see here?
So a pain point that I see in getting teams and individuals to participate in like identifying what their SLIs are, what a reasonable SLO is a lot of people might not think it's important. Why does availability matter to me? Well, if you're a software engineer who's not responsible for your product, I'm not going to give my rant now, but you should care because resiliency is the one feature, or I'm sorry, availability is the one feature that any product needs. And without availability, it doesn't mean anything. Availability is a result of resiliency, and you have to be able to know what you're measuring that by. Whether it's the response, a response time, whether it's successful or not, or a percentile of successes, or whatever. So this kind of goes to the software testing versus monitoring. You want to they don't have to have a one-to-one relationship, but they should be measuring the same level of success. So your software engineers and whoever is running them, or hopefully them, know what, like, this kind of goes into KPIs, like what is the one thing my team is measured on? Or that's a way to look at this, is your SLI is the one thing that you're using to measure your service, having acceptable availability. So driving that point home, that that availability is is the primary feature, followed only then by its core functionality, because without the availability, their feature is meaningless. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. So explaining the why, we want to be able to, we want to measure, we want to do, you can there is a whole dark world of value stream mapping that's only kind of touches on, but identifying what your dependencies are and how available they are, how resilient they are, is a big step in being able, and don't get me wrong, this will have some unhappy conversations. It's entirely possible that there are some teams that are much more, that are very dependent upon by a lot of teams that are not as available as they really should be, as they need to be. So roadmaps are going to have to change. And I didn't get into this in here. I forgot to, I left it out, unfortunately. When you are in excess of your error budget, there's a consequence. Now, nobody should be getting fired. Nobody should be like a performance review or PIP or whatever. It should mean new feature development stops, and you fix the problem, and then you fix some of the contributing factors for it. Build up the resiliency with that remaining time. Now, your product manager, owner, or scrum master might be upset because your burn down chart's going to change. Tough. The availability of your feature is more important than the new features coming out. So that is another conversation that needs to happen, and your management needs to be okay with that. Otherwise, none of this works. Yes, sir.
So as you touched on in that past, in the answer to the past question,
Yes.
SLOs need team or consequences if they are the customers are internal or the agreement is internal. Can you speak a little bit more about, or maybe examples you've seen of successful consequences or successful processes for these consequences to ensure that SLOs will be met in the future?
The question is, what are some examples of consequences when an error budget is exceeded? And it's really just sticking to that budget. If you are under budget, if you use up 99% of your budget, you're fine. No consequence at all. You just keep doing development as your ticket tracking system allows for. But once you exceed that threshold, you stop doing new feature development, and you work on resiliency. That really is the main thing. There is a talk by Jennifer Petoff. She is, I think, Senior Program Manager at Google for SRE Education. And she gave a fantastic talk at All Day DevOps this past year that she goes a little bit more into the why and how this builds into SRE, and she talks a little bit more about penalties, but it's really just not that complicated. Like, the penalty is you stop doing feature development and you instantly prioritize the resiliency and availability. Does that answer?
Yep.
Okay. Yes.
So I first see this as a evolution of metric collection thing. So I'm wondering, are you still tracking things like CPU and RAM, and maybe just keeping that as your little ops area, look at it for debugging, or is it even not worth the overhead if you're looking at higher level things that are somehow connected to it, possibly?
So the question is, do you still do metrics collection for system level metrics when you're doing SLO? Yes, and not just because I work for a monitoring task. Like, those metrics are still useful, you just probably don't need a dashboard for them right away. And you certainly don't need to alert on them. This is a more higher level thing, one for transparency and communication between teams, that, hey, if your team, let's say I'm a shopping cart team and I depend on an inventory team. They only have 3 nines. and maybe I have the same, the same SLO. It doesn't matter what my SLO is really, but if they're broken, and I go, hey, my people can't, the customer cannot look at the inventory. We are unable to add something to their cart from the inventory because your service is unavailable. Can you please go fix your thing? Well, the first step in a healthy SLO environment is you look at their exposed dashboard of SLO and say, well, we're within our error budget. So you have to sit down and chill for a few minutes. But this is also where the SL updates come from, is, look, this happens too much. We get a bunch of calls from them. We really need the inventory service to be more available than it is now. How can we prioritize that? Or are there other ways of making changes to things so that they're less user impacting, but maybe still allow you to have some downtime and innovate that stuff is still available in another mechanism, whether it's caching or blah, 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 whatever. Does that answer? Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
When I start thinking about SLOs, it's usually the aggregate. Here's my site and this is available, and that's the one that usually goes for the customer. But we know that underneath that, there's a ton of services that make that up. What's the best practice in saying, well, yes, the site's up, but these features or these services may not be. When it goes to reporting accurately that high level, do you dismiss the lower level, or how do you correctly, is there an industry standard on rolling, any given services offline that is the higher level service?
That's what I was trying to ask too.
Okay, so the question is, if my service works, but not all the pieces work, how do I report my service's availability when not all the features are available? Okay, so that is a great question, and this kind of goes back to like the velocity community, the web ops stuff of a couple of years ago. Is there was a lot of focus on, or especially a lot of talks on graceful degradation, where if a feature is not strictly if you depend on, say, like a sidebar that's being displayed. If it's not displayed, but it's also not a core feature of what your product does, it's probably okay, and you're not going to be dinged for that. They're certainly not going to show the availability for that period, but hopefully your customer doesn't miss it. But Google and Etsy and Netflix and like all of our favorite products and sites, you'll notice that things either load lazily or sometimes a feature just isn't available at the moment. It seems like the My List in Netflix has been taking a hit lately, just from my experience. But like I can still use Netflix and do other core things, even if it's slightly less convenient for me. But my SLO, like the front page SLO and being able to click a video or search for items, that's still available even if not everything has loaded or is available at that moment. So if you run the front page and there's a widget that's not available at the moment and it doesn't load, that doesn't affect you. Does that make sense?
So it sounds like you said if it's considered a core feature, it would affect the top log line.
Yes.
Feature made that straight identified.
Yes. If a core feature is unavailable and you're dependent on that, this goes back to you have to be, if it's core feature, they have to be at least as available as you are. Does that answer the question? Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Does Data.gov give training on exactly this to like people that aren't here to the wider team and mostly like management executives, directors, things like that? I believe we are road mapping a course in our training center. We have workshops at Dash and our community summits later this year. We have a lot of documentation on our site. We may have videos, but don't quote me on that. An earlier question, like, do we still care about like system CPU metrics when we're doing this? I believe that was from Liz.
yes, you still care about those metrics, you still want them available when you're looking into a problem, but they should be less front and center. And again, SLO is more a tool for you to be able to like determine, to prioritize, do I have room to continue doing feature development, and advertise that you are upholding your promises to the other teams in your company. So yes, all those other metrics that you're already using, they don't become worthless. You still need them to diagnose and fix things. Any other? Yes, sir.
The SLO, which is every piece you were showing,
Yes.
is that part of the core offering of your job, or is that an add-on?
I believe it's core. Jeremy? SLO, that's not a separate feature right now, right? Yeah, yeah. So just, you can just start playing with it. And you can also, I think you can, this is my work for like the next week, is working on the workshop. But I believe you can work with it in monitors as well to like actually alert you when you exceed your error budget. It's in beta. Thank you. Anything else? All right, you've been wonderful and have made my scale experience wonderful and lovely. Thank you.